This is a live edition of the Jake Feinberg Show, coming to you on Power Talk. Please go to our website, powertalk.live. Download our free app to your smartphone and stream all of our live local programming, including Solomon on Blast, The Jim Parisi Show, and yours truly, The Jake Feinberg Show. Can't thank you enough for making us part of your day today, and it's an honor to bring back a dear friend of the program and a guy who, one of my earliest guests back in 2011. He's always been a big supporter of mine, and he's also channeled a lot of inclusivity and also leadership through rhythm. He is originally from the great country of Canada, and also was part of the LA studio scene, and was also part of the great Bay Area music scene, and now resides in Chicago, a town that he's still learning about and figuring out. And what an honor. Pete Magadini, welcome back to the Jake Feinberg Show.
Oh, thank you, Jack. Thank you, Jake. It's always great to be back at the Jake Feinberg Show, and it's a pleasure to be here with you.
We have a game on this program called Name That Voice. I want you to listen to this voice, but more importantly, I want you to listen to the content, and then we'll come back and talk about it, okay?
All right.
Right.
Well, I think that started, and what's called the Toronto sound today is very heavily steeped in R&B. And the reason for that was back in the 60s, there was a Chitlin circuit. If you were a black band from Detroit or Chicago, you played in a black club on the black side of town. And a lot of those artists soon discovered there was no color bar in Canada. And they could come up here and play in any of the clubs. We had an area called the Yonge Street Strip, which was maybe 15, 18 bars right down the main street of Toronto. And you could go down there on a Saturday night and you could see B.B. King playing in one club and the Four Tops in another, and the Muddy Waters Band from Chicago. And so we grew up steeped in that music, not because we had a Chitlin circuit up here, but because we didn't. And the black artists could come up here and play anywhere they wanted. And England was very much the same. So a lot of the great R&B artists spent most of the rest of their lives in either England or Canada because there was no color bar here. And not only were they accepted up here, they were idolized. I would sit at the bar nursing a beer for an hour just to watch an hour of the Muddy Waters Band, or Albert King or B.B. King or Otis Rush or any of these guys. They all played in Toronto. And there was a club up here called the Blue Note, which was an after-hours club, which meant that it didn't open till 1 o'clock in the morning when all the bars closed. And all the artists used to get together and jam until dawn in this place. And it would be nothing to find yourself, on stage with Martha Reeves or singing with any one of a dozen great R&B artists that used to.
All right, Mr. Magadini, you have any idea who that is?
Well, no, not really, but I need to tell you something.
Yeah.
I'm not from Canada. I didn't get to Canada until 1970. I got to Canada.
Okay, so I'm
from...
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm from Massachusetts.
Well, I mean, that's the great state of Massachusetts. All right, so I for some reason I thought that when you were in LA and your daughter needed medical care, you moved back to Toronto, and that was where you were from. But my apologies for that. In any event, did Pete Magadini?
I don't know who that is.
So by the way, that was David Clayton Thomas from my interview with him back about March of last year.
Yeah, right.
Can you talk about any experiences you had in Massachusetts or on the East Coast playing with rhythm and blues bands? One of the revelations to me, Pete, is that Charlie Neville, Albert Tootie Heath, Coltrane, Sonny, Rollins, and the list goes on and on. Those cats didn't start playing bebop. They started playing with R&B. And so the blues was deeply rooted in the music that they played when they did transition towards bebop or post-bop. And I wanted you to talk a little bit about the experiences you had playing with blues cats.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, I should just bring you up to date on how my career matriculated from Massachusetts to California when I was a kid, to L.A., where I started listening to Johnny Otis.
Mm-hmm.
Johnny Otis had a you probably have heard about the Johnny Otis show that was on television in Los Angeles in the 50s. And he had all the blues singers on, and that show was it was on once a week. I think it was an hour. He had his own band, and he brought in these guests, Big Joe Turner, and I don't know if he had Muddy Waters, but he had some of the biggest blues stars. And during that period, also, I started listening a lot to Chuck Berry, but I was only in junior high school. My parents moved to Arizona, and in Arizona, I actually started playing professionally. And there, I started playing with some blues artists, not so much as blues artists as more rock legends. I played with the Coasters.
Wow.
When I was in Arizona.
Wow.
And every time they came through, they used me and a certain rhythm section of some of those guys who lived there. And I played with some local artists around there. Prince Shell, who was maybe the most legendary jazz blues pianist in Arizona. And there you are living in Arizona, but there's that history, especially in Phoenix,
wow,
of what was going on in the 60s. And for me, it would have been the early 60s before I moved to New York.
Can you just talk? Can you talk? No, this is so important. So, how do you spell it? What was his name? French Shell? What's his name?
Prince. P-R-I-N. Yeah, most people spell it P-R-I-N-C-E, but it was really P-R-I-N-T-Z. Prince. But he was known as Prince. And that was his first name was really Prince with a Z, but everybody spelled it and pronounced it Prince with a C-E.
Can you just talk about like how the blues and the jazz were right alongside each other at that time, and how you incorporated that into your playing? Well,
I was just out of high school, and I was playing in clubs as I had just started playing jazz, but I was playing a lot of. I was involved in some studio work at Ramsey's studio in Phoenix, and they were recording what they were trying to do the same thing as the rhythm sections were doing in L.A., except these producers, Lester Sill and Lee Hazelwood, were coming down to Phoenix to record. And I was doing some studio work at the time, and then going out at night in Arizona and playing jazz with some of the locals. And Phoenix at that time was very segregated. There was the South Side, which was the black area, and the north side, which is practically from the tracks downtown north, would be the less segregated side, if you want to say that. And I spent a lot of time down the south side because I had some friends who took me down there to hang out at first. And there was a Chitlin circuit there. And I heard Ray Charles when I was about maybe 17 years old, playing at the Calderon Ballroom, which was a big facility that brought in people and Ray Charles he had an octet, and they had just had a hit with What I Say.
Mm-hmm.
And, Tell Your Ma, Tell Your Pa. And the Raylettes were there, and they played the whole night, and people listened and danced. And this was on the south side. And there was everything in Phoenix was going on the south side, as far as I was concerned. All the jazz clubs and all the things that I was interested in was happening there. So when I left Phoenix in 1960, I went to New York City, and that's where I got a chance to actually start hanging out at Birdland and then hanging out at clubs where a lot of the well-known people played. And I actually went down a couple times to the Apollo Theater and heard those shows. And one afternoon I heard Jackie Wilson, the Coasters, Ray Charles Band, Philly Joe Jones Quartet, a movie, and then and then the Jazz Tech, I think was the
was it Art Farmer's Band?
Yeah.
Right. Unbelievable.
And,
That's a smorgasbord of music right there.
Yeah, for $2. I think it was $2, something like that. So yeah, so in New York was pretty happening, and then I went back to then I went to San Francisco after that. So
did you find?
That's how I got.
Yeah. No, did you find your? It's. I just did my second interview with Steve Swallow, and he was talking about, Jimmy Giuffre was playing pretty straight, and then he had this sort of road to Damascus moment and began this trio of free music with Paul Bley and Steve, and then of course you had Scotty LaFaro, Paul Motion, and you had these trios going on at that time. Did you have a gig in New York when you were there and where you were playing conversational? As far as I'm concerned, that was some of the most incredible. That was the original voice. That was the original time when the bass became sort of a lead voice as well as just an instrument that would just lock the groove. And did you play in any of those kinds of groups?
Well, I was a kid from Arizona. I was 19 when I got to New York.
Wow.
And,
wow.
I did find a gig playing with the two Italian guys in a bar in the Bronx where I lived. The Bronx was a Jewish area at that time, and there was some clubs out there, and I did get a gig. I was just happy to have a gig in New York. Playing in New York was, no matter where you were playing, I was playing in New York. That was exciting, but I went out and heard a lot of those guys, but as far as a player who was playing with any of those guys, I wasn't there yet. I was just mainly studying and woodshedding and practicing and hanging out, but I got to hear and hang out with a lot of the great players and in a lot of those legendary clubs at the time. Because when I left New York, I was 21 years old, and then I went out to San Francisco and then became a part of that scene more than. But I have to say that when I went to Canada, which was 1970, when I went up there, they had health care, and my first wife was Canadian, and I had a kind of a free pass if I wanted to go to Canada, and I knew some of the musicians there, so I went up there and I got busy kind of right away, and there was some clubs there that brought in people from everywhere in the States. And while I was up there, I did play with. I played 2 weeks with Chet Baker. I did two different gigs with Sonny Stitt. I played two different gigs with Zoot Sims, and let's see, there was Mark Murphy. I played with him both there and in New York.
And that's such a hot.
I played with Michelle Legrand twice while I was up there. I played with Johnny O'Neill a bunch of times. Paul Desmond, I played with him for 1 week while I was there. They were bringing all these cats up there, and I was getting a chance to play with them. And they were coming from the West Coast and the East Coast. They weren't just from, it wasn't just like New York cats, but it was New York cats and L.A. cats mainly, and maybe some Chicago guys thrown in. But there was quite an array of really well-known musicians. Don Ellis, Herb Ellis, rather. I played with Don Ellis in Los Angeles.
Sure.
Herb Ellis. And who else? I played with Jimmy Witherspoon. Now, there's another blues guy I played with, but I played with him in San Francisco. And I played with Slide Hampton in Toronto. I played with Al Cohn in Toronto. I played with Maxine Sullivan in Toronto, Dakota State, and I played 2 jazz festivals with her in Canada. So Canada offered a lot of, not only did they have their own musicians, some, great players in their own right that you wound up playing with, but also they brought in people, and local rhythm sections got a chance to play with some of these high-powered jazz stars, jazz legends.
Did you notice? I mean, it was still? I mean, even going back to what David Clayton said, those cats still felt more comfortable. I mean, there was no segregation. I know that we quote unquote had all these civil rights passages, and we quote unquote had desegregation, but I mean, we still haven't really been able to mend that fence in this country. I mean, those cats enjoyed. It was there. There was still no color bar. Still isn't a color bar in Canada.
All that David Clayton Thomas was talking about, I didn't experience any of that. I don't know any bit of a part of that scene in Canada. He was talking about the '60s, and it was very different by the time I got there.
But you knew from, so, but I mean, so it was different. But I mean, even going back to here, you knew that just from your experiences with the South Side of Phoenix, it was very segregated. This country really did it. It was just a pipeline for. I mean, John Lee Hooker brought David Clayton to New York. I mean, that to me is like an astounding thing that you had these original masters of the music, coming up there and being completely accepted, and then ultimately bringing these cats into the States. Pete, we came in with you and Don just going back, playing just horn and drums. That was on the back end of Sama Day Rollins on your Polyrhythms album. And I was hoping you could just talk to the audience about how to keep time in that kind of setting. I mean, you were locked in. You were doing it, I assume, live. And, because, I mean, there would be, I've talked to guys like John Densmore who, they'd go to Shelley's Manhole, and McCoy and Jimmy Garrison would leave the stage, and Elvin and Train would just go at it for 40 minutes. Did you have an experience like that? We're not just playing, but when you were going to Birdland or in New York, or even when you moved to the West Coast, when you saw this call and response between, a melodic instrument and a rhythm instrument?
Well, that's interesting that you asked that. One afternoon, my wife and I were at the jazz workshop in San Francisco. It must have been around 1967, 68, something like that. And we were listening to John Coltrane's quartet with Elvin Jones and Jimmy Garrison and McCoy Tyner, except Elvin wasn't there.
Yeah, no, he's been known to miss sets and not show up. Yeah, so Elvin was a no-show.
Well, it was a beautiful day in San Francisco, and here was, they've been playing, those guys played 6 nights a week, 3 shows. I don't know if they did 2 or 3 shows, but man, it was like working in the coal mines as far as the energy they put out, every night. So I hardly blame them for, kind of just wanting to take the afternoon off. But it was dark in the club, but all of a sudden you heard, we were sitting up by the bandstand. You could sit right next to the bandstand. I was on the side so I could get a good shot of Elvin, and I could hand Coltrane a drink if I wanted to. I mean, I was that close. And we heard this car door. The workshop was a long rectangular club, and the car door slammed out in front. And Elvin came in, and he was mumbling under his breath, and he had a white sweater tied around his neck like he had been out playing tennis or something. And he walked through the side of the club opposite to where his drums were, and around the back of the bandstand there was a wall at the back of the bandstand, so he had to walk around the wall. And he came out, and John Coltrane had been playing ballads. And so we were all like in this mood of, can you imagine you sitting in a club in the afternoon, this quiet afternoon in San Francisco, listening to John Coltrane play ballads? I mean, how it couldn't get better than that.
No.
The club was mesmerized. Everybody was just into it. He had taken us out in this ballad world, and everybody was, if you heard a clink in a glass, it was too loud, And Elvin got behind the drums. He sat down. He picked up both sticks in his right hand, and he hit the crash cymbal as hard as he possibly could. Wham! And the place went dead quiet. I mean, it was already quiet, but I mean, even the musicians stopped.
They stopped.
And he stopped, and then he went, and he started this groove, this infectious Elvin groove that was like, it was like a rocket ship had just taken off right in front of your eyes. And Coltrane didn't even turn around. He just started playing, and they got into some kind of a modal tune that they had played before, and they all started blowing on this thing, and the tempo was really faster than what I had sang. And they started cooking on this thing, and it went on for about 10 minutes. And then the guys, Reggie McCoy Tyner just got up and left. So it was just the bass player and Coltrane and Elvin, and the bass player hung in there for about another 10 minutes, and he left. So this has been going on for like, let's say 15 minutes. And then it was just Coltrane and Elvin for another 15 minutes.
Oh, my God.
And that's the first time I heard that. Like, I was like, well, that's something, that's happening. And so when I got with Don, I knew Don was, he loved Sonny Rollins. And I had heard this album with Sonny Rollins and Elvin where they did that as well. It was just Sonny Rollins and Elvin and Wilbur Ware. I think it's called Live at the Village Gate.
Wow. I've never heard of that.
Vanguard.
I'm more familiar with like, I forget who was drumming, but it was like Cranshaw on bass and Sonny on horn. But I got to look that. So Live at the Village Gate is Elvin and Sonny.
I think it's the Village Vanguard. Sonny Rollins Live at the Village Vanguard. I'm pretty sure that's the name of it. Yeah, I get it. It's Sonny Rollins, Elvin Jones, and Wilbur Ware. And on a couple of tracks, there's the drummer. I'll think of him. He's also a lawyer. He's quite a good drummer from that period.
Oh, it was Pete LaRocca.
Pete LaRocca, thank you.
My God, yeah. Sonny and Elvin Wilbur at Greenwich Village Vanguard, 1957.
Yeah, check that out. Check that album out. That's a classic. So that's another place where I sort of heard that dialogue between horn and drums. So that's how I brought it up to Don at the session. I said, and then I'd like to do. How about just we stretch out, because that's his tune, Selma D. Rollins. He wrote that tune, and I said, why don't you and I just stretch out for a while and play on it, and then then I'd like to take a solo, a polyrhythmic solo after that, and that'll be the polyrhythm trip on this tune. So yeah, that's.
I mean, do you stepping back from it now? I think it would be impossible to walk out of that sunshine afternoon at the workshop and not be introspective after seeing spiritual music like that. And I'm not saying it was dance music, but I am saying that it was. You had to be deeply contemplative after that kind of stuff. And my question is, Pete, over time, how have we moved from music, melodic improvisation, melodically improvised music that is burning, like this Sonny Rollins album or Train or any of that stuff, to the point now where, you go to a gig, you go to see a show, and either the music is meant for background noise, or people, if it's a more formal event, people just sit and stare at somebody's facility. There's no spontaneity. Obviously, it's a profession. Elvin came in halfway through the set, and then all of a sudden, two other cats just leave the bandstand. There's no hemming and hawing. They go at it. It was unfiltered. It wasn't unprofessional. But how have we gotten to this point where we've gone from burning music where, you had to walk away either humbled, ready to give up because someone just overwhelmed you, if you were a musician, to the point now where people just stare at people's facility and maybe nod off.
I don't think it's a whole lot different now than maybe it was back then as far as what to expect from an audience. They'll fool you sometimes and be totally into something. You think they'll never, that it's way over their head, and sometimes when you think you're playing with a band that probably is more has more of the capacity to play to a larger spectrum of what a general audience might be into, they ignore it. So I think musicians are always trying to, let me put it this way: it's always great if the audience is into what you're doing, and if it's something, of course, like I was just talking about, where it's John Coltrane and Elvin Jones. Why would you be there otherwise? If you didn't specifically go there to hear those guys play at that level. That's why the clubs were always, you'd think that musicians of that caliber would be playing larger venues, but that's what they could muster, was like a room full of people, maybe 150 or 200 people out of a whole city are into that place every night to hear Miles or Sonny Rollins or in those days, and these days too. There's I played with John Handy just before I left San Francisco. I did a concert with John Handy, and we shared the bandstand with Robert Glasper.
Sure.
And we played first, and then it came on, and I made sure to stick around. I want to hear his concert, and I was amazed at how much music Robert Glasper's band could play. And he said to this audience, because it was sponsored by a black organization in Oakland, and Robert Glasper said, well, I don't always play this concert for every audience, but I'm playing this concert for this audience. And they played some stuff that was definitely right. I could hear the progression of where he had come from, and all the roots that he has spoken about that has influenced his playing would come out with his band, and it would include polymetric stuff, and it would include backbeat, like funky grooves. I like funky grooves. I was a Motown drummer for a while. I toured with Diana Ross, and they didn't get me on that gig because they wanted me to play jazz.
No. You wanted to had to feel really good.
It was all about, and it was a lot of that playing came from my days again back in Phoenix, just playing with some of those artists who lived on the South Side, and just laying it down. And I like to hear bands who can do all that kind of stuff. And sometimes I'll sit there like the rest of the audience and go, I hope this guy doesn't play another two choruses, because I think I've heard everything he has to say,
Right. I'm talking more about the idea of, about feel. The feel is important, and your generation. See, okay, maybe the workshop only brought in 150 people that day, but it was, you had everything going on in Haight Street. You had everything going on in the Fillmore district. You had dawn sessions. You had 25 of those clubs, and that to me is how you get to feel the music, is by playing live relentlessly. So I guess more to the point, I'm saying, Denny Sywell, I just did an interview with him, and he was talking about going to this drum clinic with Ndugu. I told you this story where Ndugu, rest in peace, there was a younger drummer up, and his facility was just huge chops, and after about 25 minutes, Sywell looked over and Ndugu was passed out because there was no feel. It was just like a lot of facility. I see that with my generation. I wonder how you talk to younger cats about feel over chops.
Well, I'm a guy who wrote books on polyrhythms, and that's what I tell. I said, you want to study something that's going to improve your feel, you should study polyrhythms, because first of all, you need to have some kind of feel anyway.
Right. Right.
If you don't have that, you shouldn't be really playing music. I think.
I dig.
You can hear it in anybody's playing. Some of Elvin's solos, that you could almost play a backbeat to them, and they're so out, but they're so in at the same time. There's so much depth, So I think that we should always constantly be working on the depth of our feel. And I always say this. I use this example. I said, okay, listen, if you're in a car and you're driving at night and the headlights are only on the white line in the middle of the road, you're sort of obligated to just follow that line. You don't have much choice because you don't know what's on the other side of the lights. But if you fan the lights out across the whole highway and see that on the left you have 3 or 4 lanes that you could go in, and on the right you have 3 or 4 lanes that you could go in, doesn't it make driving down the middle a lot more comfortable? And that's what polyrhythms do. You study those other lines. You bring into focus those other rhythmic parameters that are there, and then you actually explore going into them. And then when you're playing down the middle, hey, the middle is so much more illuminated than it ever was, and the depth of your feel is so much deeper than it ever was. And it comes from the Africans in our music, and that's where it started. So I bring it all the way back. I learned something about African drumming, and I make my guys learn a little bit about some basic A-way African bell patterns. There's the root right there. Get that down, because that's where it all started. So, I think I agree with you. I think if you don't have a lot of feel in your playing, the rest of it doesn't count.
Talking to Pete Magadini here live on Power Talk on the Jake Feinberg Show. This was kind of a trip. I had an opportunity to speak to Jim Messina from Buffalo Springfield and also Poco, and he said, I want to read you this story about, and then let you extrapolate on it. He said, I said once to Milt Holland, this is from Messina, I said once to Milt Holland, I'm having such a hard time with time. I don't know sometimes if I'm rushing. He said, Jimmy, you got to look at time kind of like driving a car. I said, what do you mean? He said, imagine the steering wheel was sitting out there on the front bumper. You were driving a car and you're looking down at the double line. You're driving along. Do you think you could stay on the road easier if you were up front where you could really see the road? Or if the steering wheel was really back in the trunk, actually looking over the car? I said, well, I would think sitting right up front where I could really see it. He said, that's fine until there's a curve. If you don't see the curve coming, you'll fall off the road. He said, if you're standing on the back of the car and you're looking down the road and you can see it's going to turn, you know you're going to go to the left and you're not going to go off the road. Holland said, you've got to look at time that way. Time is coming at you. You're not moving with it. It's coming at you. Let it come to you. Don't try to go to it. After he said that to me, I suddenly got a whole new perspective. He was talking more about Latin rhythms in that sense as well. But I wanted you to, what do you think of that analogy? And you can just riff on that any way you want.
Well, yeah, I mean, essentially he's saying the same thing. It's.
How about this? How about?
I'm thinking more you're in it. I'm not thinking so much it's coming at you that you're in it.
Mm-hmm.
It's more like you're in a wave, and you need to control your part of it. I suppose a guy on a surfboard is kind of the same thing.
Right.
I mean, he's dealing with time right then and there. The time he has to remain on this surfboard in relationship to the wave he's riding, which is also in time. So they're both dealing with time, and he has to be in control of what he's doing, but he also has to understand what the wave's doing, And I think in that regard, Jim Messina and myself are kind of on the same page.
Well, no, but did you know?
I think all those analogies.
No, it was just, Messina was talking. The dude who was telling him that was Milt Holland. Did you know Milt at all?
I did not know him.
Yeah, so this is a major, like with Larry Bunker and those guys, like from that generation, percussionist, drummer, and I just kind of wanted you to talk about.
By the way, I learned a lot from Latin players.
Tell me about tell me about that one and two and it was easy. Tell me about what you learned from them.
Well, I spent some time studying timbales when I was in San Francisco, and I studied with my friend who was also played with Cal Jader when Willie Bobo couldn't make the gig. My friend Eddie Calderon was the timbale player with Cal Jader.
Wow.
In the middle '60s.
With Armando or yeah.
And Armando, that band. That's exactly right.
Wow.
And Willie Bobo was his timbale teacher, so I was really studying what he learned from Willie Bobo, and so I learned a lot of the bell patterns and the techniques on timbales, not on drum set. Drum set in Latin music came later. It used to be timbales and conga drum, and the related accessory instruments that some of the singers play, clave or shaker and things like that. But so there was a lot of Latin clubs too in the Bay Area before there was rock clubs. There was jazz clubs and Latin clubs, and so the Latin clubs were happening too. And I just want to say that the Latin players were way ahead of the curve when it came to playing polyrhythmically than maybe some of the jazz players were.
In what way? Just the
jazz players.
In what way?
Yeah, one thing about Latin players is they're playing strict rhythms based on clave, where jazz players aren't, thinking so much about clave as much as just about the grooves they're in and how deep can they make them. Even guys who even guys who are known not to be necessarily play a lot of tumbling drums like Elvin might play, but still play with a deep groove. I love Albert Heath's playing, just because he plays with such a great feel. I always loved his playing, and I love Shelly Mann's playing for that. And it doesn't have to be a lot of chops to impress me. It's all about what kind of feel that you have, and a lot of Latin players in their bands, of course, it's all about feel because they're playing dance numbers, which are also the basis for their. When you go to Cuba, it's funny, they're playing Latin rhythms, but the guys are improvising on top of the Latin rhythms in some of the bands, and they call those jazz bands.
Right.
They call it jazz bands because of the guys improvising, not because of the rhythm section's not playing jazz as we know it. They're playing Latin. So, the concept of jazz to them in Cuba, from when I was there, what I could gather was that you still based on Latin grooves or Afro-Cuban grooves, but the musicians were stretching out over these grooves and improvising in a jazz way. So these bands were actually called jazz bands, where they were playing jazz, and they were, but they were playing jazz within the framework of these, strict Latin rhythms or Afro-Cuban rhythms, which are very heavy in their own right. I mean, if you take them one step further, you're into African grooves.
Absolutely. I mean, Al McKibben used to say that was those rhythms were the closest thing to Africa.
Absolutely right.
Did you go to Caesar's a lot? The Latin club, Cesar Escarunas? Who was running what was the Latin circuit? Because, I mean, I know you didn't just go to San Francisco and wind up, finding George Duke right away. I mean, I have to believe you were playing a bunch of different gigs. Did you play at Caesar's, or did they had these boat concerts in Sausalito with Victor Pantoja? Paul Jackson said he learned everything. He learned time from those guys.
It's really funny. When I was in San Francisco, I played mainly jazz and mainly with George Duke, and I played at Jimbo's Bop City. I played that gig for a while, and I played shows at the Playboy Club, and I was also the house drummer at the Hungry Eye just before it closed. It went to Ghirardelli Square, and then it closed over there. But I had that gig, and that's sort of what drove me to L.A., because some of the work was drying up in San Francisco. And when I went to L.A., oddly enough, I wound up playing with some of the Latin guys in Los Angeles.
Which ones?
And, well, there's a guy, I wish I could think of the name of his band. He had a band. It was myself and Lynn Blessing. And
Lynn Blessing? Are you kidding me?
Yeah,
he has left us way too soon, man.
Yeah, no kidding.
Total Stone Vibes player.
Oh, a great player. And she was Lynn Blessing and Art. I'll think of the guitar player's name.
Yeah.
But we were playing around, and we had a Latin set we played, and we brought in. He always had a local conga drummer who would be featured with the band, and then we'd do a Latin set with him. And so all that experience I had from San Francisco, studying with Eddie Calderon, learning Willie Bobo timbali techniques, I applied to the drum set in Los Angeles, and because they needed a drummer, but they needed a drummer who could play Latin. So I kind of fit the bill, and so I got a chance to play, and I played at Juanita's, which was a Latin club strictly, and we played with that band, and we had Latin dancers, and I was a little nervous to think that now I'm playing for Latin dancers. I hope it's going to go down all right. But it's throwing tomatoes at me, so I guess I did okay.
Did Magadini get over to North Beach and play for Carol Doda at all or anything, or was it always just sort of the? I mean, like there was a place called the Red Balloon out there. Bop City obviously was, that was. Were you in the house band at Bop City?
I was.
Was Frank Jackson? Yeah, because there was another cat that I just interviewed who's 92, and he was played with Pony Poindexter there named Frank Jackson, piano player.
And the name sounds familiar.
Yeah, well, I mean, so Flip Nunez. Hold on,
so.
the house band at Bop City was you, Flip Nunez, and who else?
Rex Thompson on bass. He's no longer with us.
So it was just a trio.
Yeah, right.
And Flip might play organ once in a while too.
Never played organ, just piano.
Wow.
A really great piano player though.
Singer too,
Legendary.
great singer.
Yeah, you're right. A really good singer. That's right. He was a really great singer.
Actually, Michael Howell told me that Flip could just.
I played with Michael too in San Francisco.
Michael said that with Flip, if you were playing a gig, he could just stare at the audience for 20 minutes and people could be entertained.
He would what? Sorry, I missed that.
No, he said Flip was such a character that he could just stare and smile at the audience for 20 minutes and people would just be having a ball. He was such a character.
Yeah, he was a beautiful guy. Everybody wanted to know.
So,
He,
so
special.
can you just talk a little bit about this upcoming clinic that you're in Chicago now, but I really want you to talk about this. I want to promote this. This. I got an email. That was the reason I reached out to you. Is you have a something coming up, and I just want you to tell the audience about it and what it's going to be about.
Yeah, well, thank you. So on March 25th, I've been asked by the one of the major drum shops here in Chicago, Vic's Drum Shop on Loomis Street. It's quite. If you ever been in Chicago and been to Vic's Drum Shop, you know what I'm talking about. It's like a retail museum. I mean, it's huge. And anyway, they invited me to do a clinic, and I'm doing a clinic on my specialty, which is polyrhythms. I generally don't always give this clinic just on polyrhythms, but this one I'm doing it just on polyrhythms. And my books are 50 years old this year. And
wow, congratulations, man! That's awesome.
Yeah, thanks.
That's awesome.
And I still get to talk about them, and I still get to show people how it works, So if you want to find out about it, you don't have to be a drummer to come to this particular clinic. It's on March 25th, 6 p.m. at Dick's Drum Shop here in Chicago, and it should be pretty good. And for the price of admission, the first 50 people who get there get a free polyrhythm book. Musician's Guide to Polyrhythms will be given out free for the first 50 participants. So
I want to ask you a question. This is really important because I mean, whatever you might read, and I have the Jake Feinberg Smithsonian thing going on Facebook, but I mean, I actually don't listen to a huge array of music, especially if I'm in the car. One of the CDs I have is Polyrhythms by Pete Magadini. I want to ask you, though, I mean, you were a tabla student at the Ali Akbar Khan College of Music. Sometimes when I listen to polyrhythms, though, you're playing the traps, it almost sounds like it's impossible that you didn't overdub a couple of things. And I wanted you to talk about how to play polyrhythms, if in fact you did overdub anything, but also how to translate polyrhythms from its, indigenous, from the tablas and the other Indian percussion to the trap set. Because I've become a much more proficient timekeeper since the last time we really caught a hang. I'm not professional by any means, but can you talk about how the two are different? Because I mean, the tabla stuff that makes the polyrhythms there. How does that translate onto the drums?
Well, it doesn't very well. That's how the book came about.
Right. I
was just fortunate to be in this class with Manaparush Misra, who had come from India with Ali Akbar Khan. He was Ali Akbar Khan's tabla player, drummer, and he was the teacher of the tabla class. And I had never been with someone who was proficient on a percussion instrument as he was. And what he could play, most of us would just sit there and marvel at it, and probably none of us in the class, at least I can't speak for the other guys, but for myself, even though I'd been studied percussionist and a drummer for a while, what he was doing rhythmically was way beyond me. I mean, what the heck, he'd play one composition and stack two more different rhythmic compositions on top of that. And, he'd know where he was all the time. And in his head, he would be keeping the first rhythm he started with, and he had playing all these other new polyrhythmic, difficult cycled compositions on top of that. And, but fortunately, he let me stay after class and bring my drum pad, and he explained to me how some of the time ratios worked, and that I understood because that was pretty logical and pretty simple. But if you're playing in 4/4, and then you go, if you go 1, 2, 3, 4, and then you go 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, you double it. That's twice as fast. Well, that's a time ratio of 2 to 1. Well, in between that 4 and twice as fast, there's also 3 other time ratios. There's 5, 6, and 7. So 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8 were all these time ratios he explained to me. They all had titles. And he could play in all of these and improvise in all of these as comfortably as he could just the 4/4 or the 1-to-1 time ratio. He was comfortable in all of them. And I thought to myself, well, if we had a method where we could take our notation and get us into these time ratios, then we wouldn't learn about how to play these difficult Indian compositions because we'd have to be an Indian musician to do that. We'd have to learn how to play the tabla and learn all about their music. That's a lifetime's of work.
Right.
But we could understand these time ratios, and drummers like Elvin and and Philly Joe and Max and some of these guys were already playing in these time ratios. If they knew it or not, it didn't matter because they were just falling.
Right. They were
there.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, but some of us, I felt, had to learn about how to fall into them. We had to sort of dig them out first, and then we could fall into them. So that's how the books came about. But that applies to all musicians. If you study this for a little while, you find that it's not complicated. It's pretty simple, and it makes you a better musician. That was the chief idea of writing the methods. And there's a lot of there's a lot of fiction out there about these things as being some kind of nebulous, theoretical, hypothetical, rhythmic questions that I'm looking at for answers, but they're not hypothetical. They're real. It's just like C, E, and G of a chord. That's real stuff. The same thing applies to rhythm, especially time ratios or polymeters. So. Yeah,
but there is something about there is something about the. I remember John B. Williams, the great bass player, told me he was with Benny Carter on a world tour in the 70s. I think Earl Palmer was on drums, and he went and bought a sitar in Pakistan, and he was just searching for a book. He was searching for some kind of book on how to learn the instrument. And
exactly,
he said where he couldn't find one because they said it's all teacher to student. It's all passed down from teacher to student. It's the same way in the motherland of Africa. When the Europeans went over there, it drove them nuts because they couldn't notate something that they were playing. So that's that's probably the bridge you've had to the gap you've had to bridge is just this idea of sort of putting into quantifiable, meaningful data points, a language and music that is more passed down from father to son or teacher to student.
Yeah, well, that's right. I mean, the music is that's right. In Indian music, it's all syllables and it's passed down from teacher to student. That's right. That's pretty much how it goes. Of course, nowadays with recordings and you don't have to have the teacher right there. You can go on YouTube and find that teacher if you want and learn something about it. But you mentioned something that is interesting. You said bass players. I've played with some great bass players, and I've noticed that the great bass players, they know more about chord changes than sometimes the piano players do. And yet they just play one note, right?
Right.
But, you ever hear a bass player talking to a piano player? Said, now, what did you play there? Did you play a flat 5? Or is that on what note did you use? Did you play, what inversion did you play? Did you play the ninth on the top? Or they want to know all about the inner workings of this chord that the piano player might play on a chord change, and yet the bass player is just playing one note. But those guys the great bass players are hearing all the notes. And that's pretty much what I'm talking about with polyrhythms. You might be playing just the one rhythm, but you're hearing everything around it. And bass players, they hear one note of a change, but the good ones, they hear the whole chord. And they hear every note in it, and they even want to know how you're inverting, what inversion you're using, or what alternate chord you might be playing there.
They have huge ears. I mean, Alex Blake told me, because he grew up playing with Potato, the bass player, Alex Blake. He came and Potato and all these Latin percussionists. So they, the timbal in Latin music, that's sort of the bass player is supposed to follow that, right? And Alex Blake said he'd follow it for about 4 bars, and then he'd go out and experiment. And the drummers were like, "Can't you just play it straight, man?" But he couldn't, because he was hearing all the stuff all around him from that indigenous percussion.
Interesting.
Really interesting stuff. I mean, what is the most important thing to convey to younger cats at this clinic about how about rhythm in general? What would be the best thing that you, in your mind, that you could get across to these cats? That they could walk out and do some deep introspection, or just be enlightened and inspired?
Well, generally in a clinic like this, most of the time, most people don't understand the difference between a polyrhythm and a polymeter. So we talk about the 5 basic polymeters, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. And once I just talk about the first simple one, which is 6, the most simple one is double time, which I just told you about, twice as fast, 2 to 1. And the next one is the one in the middle, 6/4. And we explore that for a while, and then I say, these same principles will apply to all these other polymeters, because once you have a polymeter, then you understand how the polyrhythms work within that polymeter. But what they'll go away with, hopefully, is that just the basic knowledge of this first one, 6, and how important it is to our music, because it relates to African more than Indian. Although my influence for this book was from the Indians and what they could do rhythmically, I wanted to be able to do a little bit. But talking about feel and the polyrhythms that we understand, and where jazz came from, and New Orleans music and Afro-Cuban and everything else is from West Africa. And I explore some of those rhythms at the Polyrhythm Clinic. So if you leave there with going, hey, I know more about African and 6/4 than I ever knew before, and I'm going to go home and practice some of this stuff because I can see the value in it, then I think I've had a successful day.
I just want, before I let you go, I wanted you to talk about, you connected me with, Lee Charlton connected me with Bryce Rohde, and rest in peace. And then, but the cat that is, and I think he's still with us, but he was such a character, and such a badass player. I'd like you to talk about, tell me a good Peter Appleyard story.
Oh, yeah. Wow.
I have some fantastic albums. By the way, I also have this sort of, I have at least one Appleyard album with you and Dave Young on it. I also have this Welcome to Canada LP with Pete Magadini on drums. It's weird. It's awesome. It is so bizarre. I mean, it's like, Canadian just a bunch of Canadian tunes, but yeah.
Yeah, it's not called Welcome to Canada, though.
It's you know what I'm talking about. It's like a Toronto.
Yeah, Toronto. It's the word Toronto.
Exactly. It's just like anytime you find Magadini on a session, you got to grab that album. But no, Appleyard was a serious. I mean, the guy goes way back. I mean, just tell me a little bit about Give me a good Appleyard story as we wrap set 2 here.
Well, two things. One thing before I let you go, during the period of all these periods we're talking about, I was always playing with Mose Allison. I was playing with him during the early days in the Haight-Ashbury days in San Francisco, all the way up to the last gig I did with him at the Blue Note in Tokyo in 2012.
Right on.
So it's a big influence on my life because Mose Allison was a really terrific piano player. He could do a lot of stuff that nobody else I ever heard play as much as he did, and polyrhythmically he was a master at it. We never even talked about it. He was just the way he played. But Mose Allison was an important artist that I played with for a long time, and I produced his last album, as a matter of fact. But Mose Allison Live in California, which is out. You can get it on Amazon.com.
Oh, very cool.
But
yeah.
Peter Appleyard, a vibes player from England who wound up living in Toronto and would call me from time to time to play his gigs. And, he played with Benny Goodman for a long time in Benny Goodman's later years. And Peter was a really terrific musician and kind of a character. Hired good musicians all the time. I always liked to play with him because he always had players that I wouldn't normally play with. I wouldn't think all the time,
I love it.
Yeah.
You throw him right into that gumbo,
Yeah, he'd have. That's right. He just put guys together. One year he called me to do this jazz festival, and it was Bucky Pizzarelli was a guitar player.
Oh man!
And it was leftover guys who were still alive who played with Benny Goodman. And they had the original. We played Sing, 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 and they gave me the original part to read. And I thought that was pretty cool. Only with Peter Appleyard would I get the original drum part for Sing, Sing, Sing to read at this jazz festival in Canada, which was.
So he really came out. We're talking about big band or Benny Goodman small combo. We're talking about big band, right?
Big band, yeah.
Yeah.
But both. Some of his small combo things, I think we played some of his music too. But he didn't play Benny Goodman music very often. But in this particular concert, it was because everybody except myself that was featured guests on the concert had played with Benny Goodman at some time or other.
I just want to read it. I mean, this is the most badass. I mean, this album that I have is from '77. Appleyard's playing everything. You're listed as playing percussion, but you want to talk about all the the Toronto cat, Dave Young, Bernie Sineski, Mo Kaufman, Ed Bickert, Rob McConnell. I mean, it is a funky, it is an amazing, kind of insane album.
You know what was hard about that album? It was direct to disc. That means
You're
that
darn right about
you had
that.
to do one complete side without a mistake, because if anybody had a problem, they would burn the acetate as they were doing the album. So in other words, you were burning the master as you were doing the album, because we're talking about LPs now. So they wanted a clean sound. They didn't want to have tape sound anymore. So they burned directly onto the acetate that printed the albums after that. And so they'd have to do a complete side. So when you got through with the track, they bring the pods down and they let the 2 or 3 seconds go by. They bring the pods back up, and then you're in track 2. So you have to do that whole side without a mistake. And if there's an error, technically or musically, you have to go back to the beginning. Not unlike tape where you could just, pick it up at that track. You'd have to start over from square one. So there's a lot of pressure on those recordings. Toronto guys were good at that. Since we last talked, I've interviewed Sineski and Thompson and Terry Clark. I freaking love these guys. This is like, it just feeds me the whole time, Magadini. And let's do another interview
later on in 18 so I can get an understanding of how you're dissecting the urban jungle of Chicago.
Well, I'll tell you one thing. I'm hearing some great young musicians playing here in Chicago. Some great young musicians, both white and black. And I'm planning to do an album that's going to be called Pete Magadini in Chicago. And I'm going to use some of these young guys before they're totally famous, because they're going to be, and I wouldn't be able to afford them otherwise. But maybe now, while they're still young, I can entice them to do an album. And I'll let you know when that's done, and we can talk about that.
Well, I just also want to say, I don't think Pete Magadini ever got into music for fame and fortune. That's one of my problems with younger cats today. It's like, what are your intentions, you know? I mean, when you say they're going to get too big, and yeah, maybe they'll get to a point where they're just rocking a professional life in music, which is great. But I think that's also part of the problem that my daughters are growing up with, and is that none of you guys got into music to be rich or famous. You got into music to make good music, and that's what it's about. And any real serious grounded cat knows that. So, yeah, when that CD comes out, let's hit again.
Sounds good. Jake, thanks so much.
Yeah, I love you, Mags. Keep swinging, man. Talk to you soon.
Continue your great work. It's wonderful that you're doing this with so many sidemen.
Yeah,
we all appreciate.
Well, David Clayton Thomas is not a sideman, so you know we're trying to keep building up too. I mean, we're going here. We're on our way.
Hey, one of my students was his drummer for a long time, Paul DeLong in Toronto. Played with David Clayton Thomas, so
wow,
went full circle.
Love you, Maggie. Yeah, man. Have a great and listen. Good luck at that. Good luck at the clinic too. I mean, all the best. He's great to hang.
Okay, thanks very much.
Later on.
Bye.
Bye. Dear friend of the program and Hall of Fame drummer Pete Magadini. That's a wrap for the Jake Feinberg Show. And we'll be back tomorrow with a couple of more guests, Karen Stackpole and Mala Waldron. Until then, we'll pick up my interview with George Clinton P-Funk. Until then, peace. By the 70s, Steely Dan and cats like that were getting $500,000 they were in the studio all day trying to perfect a song. But I mean, I get the impression with these demos that you were cranking out from the Brill Building, you didn't have that much time. Can you put us inside there to talk about how you got through it, and not just that, but the music came out at very high quality?
Well, we were, like I said, we were doing demos for Motown at the time, and Joe Bett. We was cutting songs because Joe Bett was such a hot publisher. Everybody wanted a Joe Bett song. So we got, songs pushed, did demos on Motown songs and new songs from songwriters on the East Coast. So we did that all day, every day. And writers in there, and they would give us a session. We can do 3 of our songs in the evening. George Kerr, who became head of Sylvia Robinson's label, he was our boss. Sidney Barnes, who become the lead singer of Rotary Connection, him and Minnie Riperton.
Wow.
All of